Today, our world revolves around the concept of a nation-state and how our way of life reflects our national identity. However, the nation hasn't always dictated the world's structure. Other, smaller group identities, such as family, kin, local communities, and the city-state, have all helped to organize our way of life. Archaeological knowledge has shown that these social structures can be seen in grave markers and burial practices. The grave sites we have seen and studied reflect and reinforce group identity, whatever that may entail, which has changed, fluctuated, and grown throughout time from the Bronze Age, through the geometric and archaic ages, to classical Greece, and even to the Greece of today.
The Bronze Age took place from before 3000 BC to around 1200 BC. This time period can be split into three broad categories: early, middle, and late Bronze Age. Early Bronze Age spanned from before 3000 BC to 2000 BC. Middle Bronze Age took place from 2000 BC to around 1625 and 1725 BC, and late Bronze Age occurred from 1625 and 1725 BC to 1200 BC. There are two main groups of civilizations that were living on the Aegean Islands and the mainland at this time: the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. The Minoans lived on modern-day Crete. Skipping the cist and shaft graves era, the Minoans invented a type of tomb called a thalos. These tombs were circular and made of stone. There was a single entryway into the chamber. This architecture is called post and lintel construction. They were built above ground and used by generation after generation, suggesting a strong familial tradition in burial. This powerful family union that stood up against other families is the beginning of this idea that the individual was living and dying for something bigger than themselves, which is the basis upon which nationalism was formed. The Mycenaeans lived on the mainland of modern-day Greece. In the Middle Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans used cists, which were simply stone-lined pits to bury their dead. They arranged the body in fetal position and surrounded it with grave goods. The grave goods of this time period consisted of a few pieces of gray mignon ware pottery. They continued to use this type of tomb into the late Bronze Age. However, at the end of the Middle period, the first shaft grave was made. Kelowna, a site on an island right off the coast of the mainland, is where the first shaft grave was created. Buried in it was a warrior of the town, for he was buried with his sword, a helmet, and other expensive goods. This was the beginning of the shaft grave era for the Mycenaeans. Shaft graves were fancier than cists. They were larger, and most had a roof of some sort and a stone marker. Grave Circle B, the older of the two grave circles in Mycenae, shows the transitions from cists to shaft graves. It contains 10 early cists and 14 newer shaft graves. As time progressed, each individual grave became more and more elaborate, and grave goods became more lavish. Grave Circle A contained only 6 shaft graves, but they were larger and more expensive than those in Grave Circle B. These graves contained multiple generations of remains, and they were laid on their back instead of arranged into fetal position. Archaeologists believe that these two grave circles represented two different rich families who had a rivalry. The sheer amount of gold found in these shaft graves is surprising. In fact, there was more gold found at these two grave circles than on the whole island of Crete. They kept their ancestors supplied with these great treasures, but why? Because they represented the family, the entity that every generation in that grave and burying their loved ones in that grave could connect to. The recurring theme of a dedication to a group instead of acting more like individuals is back. These grave sites were very important to these people. In fact, they were even more important to them than their defensive wall. At one point, Circle A was outside of the defensive walls. These walls were torn down and rebuilt around the grave circle. So while their first line of defense, the walls that protect the city, were down, the grave circle was still standing. This shows the important role that the graves played in the identity of Mycenae. Eventually, as different groups of people started coming into contact with each other, the Minoan thalos tombs caught on in the mainland of Greece. However, the Mycenaeans gave it their own spin. Instead of building straight up, they built their tombs into hillsides. These tombs were incredibly difficult and time-consuming to build. Why would they take the time to do this? Why couldn't a shaft grave suffice anymore? Because it wasn't grand enough for the family. A shaft grave was no longer worthy. Thallus tombs had even more pricey grave goods than shaft graves did. Eventually, though, shaft graves became unrealistic, so chamber tombs were created. Chamber tombs were carved into rock and filled with gold. It still had a dromos, like a thallus tomb, but it did not take quite as many man-hours to build. The development of the types of burials and tombs that occurred over the span of the Bronze Age is astounding. As the years passed, burial practices became more and more elaborate as first families, then civilizations band together to compete against other families and civilizations. It was a contest of who could honor the dead more, who had the better ancestors, and who was better overall. This idea of us versus them began in this time period.
So the Mycenaean Age ended with a bang, and the beginning of the Geometric Age really shows this decline. Some even consider the Geometric Age the Dark Ages of Greece, although that's a controversial term, to say the least. However, there are many reasons why we can think of it as a decline. Settlements were falling apart. There were no more palaces, more elaborate administrative or economic systems to go with those palaces. The pottery was simpler and full of geometric shapes, hence the term Geometric Age. Most noticeably, though, was the dramatic population decline. By 1000 BC, they had hit rock bottom by losing almost 75% of their population. We can see that population decline in the lower number of graves. Fewer people lived, therefore fewer people died, therefore fewer people were buried, and there were fewer graves. The Geometric Age, especially the beginning of the era, which started in 1100 BC, is definitely a time of smaller population. Despite the lower number of graves, though, Geometric Age grave sites are still really helpful in determining their cultural identity. It seems that their primary group identity were familial ties and kinship ties. Their family loyalty and status is apparent in the objects that they have buried with them in their graves. Some people of the Geometric Age would bury precious items or items that exemplified their family wealth. In a lovely island east of Athens, there is a burial tomb found in Lefkandi. It was huge. The Lefkandi burial site, thousands of years ago, originally included a house used for ritual meals and was later covered by a huge earthen mound. The tomb was full of riches. The woman inside was buried with dress pins of bronze and iron and jewelry of gold and electrum. Not only was the tomb full of valuable objects, but the man found inside the tomb was also cremated, which shows that he was of higher importance, even heroic importance. Cremation is an attempt to recreate the heroic scenes of epics, most noticeably Homer's Iliad. This man was obviously important. A rich cemetery grew up around the Lefkandi tomb, which shows that the elite of the Lefkandi clearly wished to associate themselves with the occupant of the great tomb, even to emulate his funeral. The tomb and cemetery attest to the prosperity of the local elite. This gravesite was a place where the idea of family and the idea of community became intertwined. The man, who was their hero, and the woman he was buried with, they became central points in the community where they would congregate, literally and figuratively. Another example of community congregating around a single person or a single important family is the huge amphora from the Dipolin Cemetery, which we saw at the National Archaeological Museum. The mourners surround the dead person, obviously distraught, which shows the importance of this person. The Geometric Age burials reflect the beginnings of coming together as a community around a local hero or an important family.
The Greek Archaic period began during the mid-8th century BC and lasted to the beginning of the 5th century. The Greek people spread all throughout the Mediterranean, using their seeps to establish trade routes as they went. Perhaps the most important of these routes reached Egypt, where the Greeks became inspired to create two of their most famous types of sculpture: the youth statue, male versions of which are called choros, female versions chorai, and the stele. Reserved for the elite classes and placed on or near their graves, these two sculpture types helped reinforce the image of the elite as the role model for society. For the Greek observer, the first noticeable feature of the Kouros is its nude state. This was so the sculpture's observers had a visual model for the ideal body of the era. The figure's radiant sexuality and nearly unattainable good health help make the case for attaining an active role in society. This guy is also one hell of a climber. I'm looking at you, Gildner. Moving away from the figure's lack of clothes, one next notices its stance. The statue stands tall, its eyes pointing forward with one foot in front of the other. These features give the distinct impression of a leader. The shoulders are in a confident position, the eyes are not looking back or to the sides for direction, and the figure as a whole seems to be moving forward, as if on a mission. With such a marker placed near the tomb of an important man, any observers coming to pay their respects find it easy to envision themselves living up to the figure's expectations. The Korai is simply a female version of the Kouros with differences according to gender. When a Korai is commissioned, it appears fully clothed in a full-length tunic. This is another reinforcement of social status, as the featured clothing styles are new and expensive.
She's just the girl I'm looking for.
Additionally, in the figure's hands usually rest two objects. First, a seed container, and second, some kind of symbolic orifice. The right hand of some figures, instead of holding an orifice, appears to grab hold of the figure's clothes or are halfway covered by the clothes. Whichever is chosen by the sculptor, the theme is the same. The hands symbolize fertility and hidden interiors, leaving little doubt as to the ideal role for women in society. The stele is another type of monument appearing as early as the geometric period, used to mark the graves of the deceased. Beginning with the Archaic period, though, the stelae begin to feature intricate carvings both on the capital and near the base. The capital here is a mythical beast of Bolivian origin called a sphinx, made up of the head of a woman, the wings of an eagle, and the body of a lion. Such beasts were to act as guardians, revealing the fearful uncertainty many Greeks still harbored concerning death and the underworld. The reliefs below the Sphinx, however, are more thought-provoking. Unlike the Korai Kure, whose very style suggests the elite of any society, the grave reliefs feature scenes from the everyday life of regular citizens. These scenes may feature one individual, or many. There may be additional beasts in the panel, or flying outside. The room for variation here exists in stark contrast to the supremely ordered world of the Korai Kure, yet both types of sculpture have been found together in the same location. The implications for accurate views of popular culture are extraordinary, but no definitive answer can be reached at this time.
Victory over Persia and Carthage changed the Greek world forever. Greeks began to see themselves as a people, and a new sense of ethnic identity was emerging. The new democracy in Athens led to commercial centers and cities becoming increasingly regularized. Burial practices in this time period for the most part mirrored this new society. War between Athens and Sparta started in 431 and had a significant impact on Athenian society and tombs. The interesting thing about burial practices in the classical period was the apparent cycles of lavishness and restraint. Tensions emerged when wealthy Athenians grew tired of the democratization and desired a more elevated status. In some cases, wealthy Athenians began setting up their own monuments, and in some cases even taking over the symbols of the state. The opening of the classical period in burial practices is marked by the dramatic shift from extravagant tombs in the Archaic era to tomb sculpture ceasing by 480. The new democratized society, especially in Athens, revealed marble grave monuments to be increasingly rare and simplistic burial practices becoming commonplace. Instead of an extravagant sculpture or korai marking a grave, the early classical era featured slabs of wood or shallow mounds. Keramikos Cemetery in Athens was used from 1100 to 200 BC, and then again in Roman times. At Keramikos, less than 5% of Athenian graves dated 500 to 425 can be related to monuments, and the real figure may be under 1%. It is hard to be precise about exact numbers since many tombs are only partially excavated or poorly published, but it is certain that the figure is very low. Even the Athenian nobility, who had grown accustomed to the lavish practices, were more restrained during the classical
acted as a time for Athenians to display their wealth. The classical era led to more restrained and austere practices, with more people using the same area to bury their dead.
In Athens, there are a few exceptions. At least two sequences of monumental tombs dating 500 to 425 BC are found in Keramikos, within sight of the Demotian Sema, where the state funerals took place. Clearly, those families for 3 generations ignored restraint.
Attic white ground lakithi correspond to this period of Athenian democracy.
These oil jars were perfectly suited to tombs, but were not ideal in real life.
Cremation and white ground lakithi are closely related. Most white ground lakithi date to 425 to 400 BC, the same time that cremation was the main burial custom in Athens. Some scholars say that the practice of cremation was reserved mostly for the rich. One scholar claims that there has to be some relation between white ground lakithi and cremation, since both declined in popularity after 400.
This correlation suggests a change in funerary practices. Lavish burials of any sort during the early classical were funded by the state. Only men who died in battle would receive elaborate burial in a public tomb. Only a minority of Athenians died in battle, but the state funerals were a crucial part of democratic ideology. The war graves had altar-like stone monuments topped with statues and 10 inscribed stone casualty lists, and sometimes they were even topped with a sculpted frieze. In burying its war dead, then, the Athenian community appropriated them forever, and at the Demotian Sema, all distinctions, individual or familial, economic or social, that might divide Athenians, even in their graves, were abolished.
About 6 orations or imitations survive in whole or part, dating 430 to 420. The same general themes appear in all of them. One is the virtue and timelessness of Athenians as a community of warrior equals, and the Athenians as the only Greeks born from the soil, so they are the virtuous and truest.
After the Peloponnesian War, demand for sculpted tombs reappeared. The trend started out slow and then flooded in the High Classical period.
Completion of the Parthenon in 432 may have also been a contributing factor, since sculptors were looking for work. Soon after, sculpted votive reliefs appeared in large numbers. Another factor may have been nostalgia for the archaic past. The Athenian community wanted to abandon the democratic restraints, and wealthy Athenians may have gotten tired of subordinating themselves to democratic burial ways.
What is interesting about the return of the sculpture in tombs of the classical era is that the great chori of the archaic era, the old sculptures of the Elite, never made a full comeback. The more acceptable format was now a stele, which is traditional and more civic-minded. They started out as blank, some featured a single person, and then others started to appear with 2 or 3 figures. Some steles even went so far as to imitate 3-dimensional statues, but they were never actual sculptures in the classical era.
Portraying the dead in these sculpted scenes reveals the increasing awareness in Greeks that they were part of a community beyond just family. They were recognizing the unity of the Greek community as a whole.
Now that we've studied the graves of the past and how they reflect and even reinforce group identity, we're going to look at modern grave sites and see how they compare. First stop, the First Cemetery of Athens, which is located right in CYA's backyard. Originally, it was established by a Greek royal decree and is currently under the jurisdiction of the municipality of Athens. But interestingly enough, outside, non-Greek organizations, such as the World Monuments Fund, also help maintain and fund the cemetery.
Burial sites we've studied, from Bronze Age to Classical and everything in between, have an undeniable similarity and influence on today's burial practices and burial sites. Think about it. One similarity is that the burials we study and oftentimes see are burials of wealthy people or people who are very important to their community.
When studying most burials, the objects found, such as gold jewelry or ornate utensils, obviously belonged to a member of the aristocracy. The people buried with these objects were wealthy, or VIP status.
That's a serious flaw in archaeology today. We focus on the big money objects instead of focusing on or even analyzing the graves and burial sites of the poor members of the community. We are not getting the full picture. And that bias is something that antiquity has in common with today's burial practices. Right now I'm standing by an impressive but a bit over the top gravesite because it's obvious that it's either a very important person or a very wealthy person, and in fact it's both. It's Heinrich Schliemann.
Schliemann is considered a pioneer of archaeology and is famous for discovering Troy too, along with many other sites. He is buried here at the First Cemetery of Athens, even though he is of German descent. His mausoleum is even sculpted in classical Greek style.
Why did Schliemann decide to be buried in a Greek cemetery with a Greek-style graves marker? Does he value the Greek identity over his German heritage? The iconic archaeologist decided to embrace Greece's ideal concept of nationalism.
Just like gravesites 2,000 plus years ago, cemeteries today are often filled with, or most prominently revolve around, wealthy and important persons. Even today, our societies are run by and heavily influenced by these people. Another similarity between today's burials and ancient burials is the emphasis on war heroes.
The First Cemetery of Athens opened in 1837. Here, the Greek state interns those who have played a foundational role in the formation of modern Greece, as well as those who have enriched the idea of what it means to be Greek. Several key national figures, such as Marcos Posteris, Constantine Carnaris, and Richard Church, are honored here with elaborate tombs and monuments. And just like the glorious tombs of ancient Greece, these sculptures, monuments, and other assorted grave markers are all dedicated to the commemoration of those laid to rest here. But why gather all of these notable Hellenes and Philhellenes into one site? For the same reason classical Athens practiced mass burial for her war dead. For the same reason the Mycenaean rulers created elaborate tombs and burial mounds. National cemeteries are a useful patrimonial tool in the preservation of an idealized heritage. Many heroes, national and foreign, are buried in the First Cemetery. The great men and women that are gathered here are meant to remind visitors of Greece's struggle for independence from the Ottoman Empire. It is a place for people to walk and remember those who gave their lives for freedom, those who gave their lives in order that the young nation might survive, and those who have built Greece upon the shoulders of they who came before. The heroes buried here together give the impression that they were just as unified in life as they are in death. But during the War of Independence and the following Civil War, many of these men found themselves on opposing sides, even fighting each other at times. But the Greek state has collected all of their remains here in an attempt to erase or at least fade the fractured past, and instead project the idea that all of these heroes' factions were completely unified in their desire to see Greece free. The Greek Orthodox Church has dominated Greek religious culture since Byzantine times and is very prevalent today. The Greek government has done a fantastic job of trying to incorporate national figures into the Orthodox belief almost on the level of sainthood. I witnessed this at the holy monasteries of Matora, where there is a room that had originally been dedicated to the saints of the church and decorated with paintings of them. When I visited, the center of the room and much of the wall space has been co-opted of paintings of the heroes of Greece's modern wars. The likening of these national figures to the martyrs of the church has no small effect. This was a flagrant display of the Greek state's desire to see these men and women, the foundation of modern Greece, almost worshipped religiously, on the same levels as the martyrs, thus trying to use death to unite the religious and national heritage of Greece. This is really a power play by those that wish to shape the Greek national identity by incorporating idealized national figures into the primarily Greek religion.
Today is no different. Modern Greece honors their fallen war heroes and even has a tomb of the unknown soldier. Sounds familiar, right? Many countries have tombs of their unnamed heroes, the US included. Although all of these tombs are fairly similar, we as Americans would not feel comfortable if the unknown soldier was found to be from a different nationality. In fact, people would be outraged if the unknown soldier actually happened to have other nationalistic origins. Greece is the same. Their unknown soldier is for their nation and their nation only. One of the ways they distinguish this tomb as solely Grecian is by the attire worn by the guards. Their uniforms are modeled after Klephtes clothing. Klephtes were Greeks who fought against the Ottoman rule and occupation of Greece.
Burial traditions play an important role in our communal identity in that they help us remember those who came before us, while still allowing us to look to the future. Most importantly, they bring us together, as a people, as a family, even as a nation, because death is the one thing we all have in common.